Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Dr. Emma Briant, who is a scholar in political communication who researches contemporary propaganda and information warfare, its governance in an age of mass surveillance, and its implications for democracy, security, inequality, and human rights. She is also an associate at the University of Cambridge's Center for Financial Reporting and Accountability, as well as owner of Maven of Persuasion LLC, a consultancy that advises and trains on disinformation threats and ethics in influence. Emma Briant, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to join you. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. The conversation I'd like to have with you today, Emma, will cover your expertise in some recent articles on propaganda and public trust. But before we get into these topics, could we please start by getting your assessment of our strategic landscape, especially related to the information environment?
Well, I think things are changing incredibly rapidly, especially over the last 2 months. We've seen, obviously, of course, Europe attempts to ban RT and things like this. And in the US, we're seeing, changes in ownership of major platforms that, are central to our, communication infrastructure. We are seeing, threats/promises to transform things into like free speech platforms and so on, and changes taking place to the rules that govern, our communication space that will probably be quite far-ranging. It's hard to know how to predict this sort of thing at the moment. We've also seen in the kind of government space, we've seen changes to the way that Homeland Security and national security establishments are responding to disinformation threats. And I think things are rapidly changing. Like, for instance, in the UK, we've got new measures to respond to disinformation that are AI powered. And I see everything transforming in a way that I think is hard for ordinary people in the public to really keep track of. And one of the things that concerns me greatly is that we have these kind of public conversations about the rapid changes and responses and understand the implications they have. Otherwise, we end up with, a public that is getting increasingly worried about censorship, about, efforts to respond to disinformation that, that perhaps raise free speech concerns, rightly or wrongly.
Right, for sure. And I should have mentioned at the top, we are recording this on April 27th, 2022. So we are about 8 weeks or so into the Russia's war with Ukraine, number one. And also this week, just a couple of days ago, it was announced that Elon Musk is purchasing Twitter. So both of those dynamics are quite relevant to this conversation. Maybe we could do a quick level set, Emma. There's terms are important, and so I'm pretty sure we're going to be getting into things like propaganda, misinformation, disinformation. This is your area of expertise. Could you quickly define these terms? Maybe start with propaganda.
Yes, so I specialize in researching propaganda and information warfare, and I tend to propaganda gets defined in all sorts of different ways. There are some people who tend to think of it as like, actually, it's just what the enemy does, you know, and we put out information. I tend to think of it in what might be an old-fashioned way, as a neutral kind of concept, where, you know, really it's about the deliberate coordination of communications, you know, symbols, different kinds of messaging, for the purposes of changing behavior, emotions, or ideas of a particular target audience or group. Now that means it's like a strategic, deliberate effort. And one of the tools of propaganda might be putting out what we're now calling of disinformation. And I think we forget very often that disinformation, so deliberate lies, essentially, deliberate falsehood, can also be accompanied by truthful information, or information that maybe is being obscured, the source is obscured, so sort of gray propaganda, what we used to call gray propaganda, which, you know, we used to get, you know, compared to black propaganda being the falsehoods, and white propaganda being the, you know, truthful kind of narratives that you put out. Now, in the context of Russia and its recent war in Ukraine, you know, we're tending to focus very much on talking about disinformation, but actually I think that coming together of these different threads, the false, the true, and the gray, is really interesting and pertinent to the current conflict. We see, you know, often I think proxies being increasingly used, because Russia's own outlets, you know, state-funded media like RT are getting increasingly shut down or being labeled as state media, and that makes them less trusted. You know, they are struggling to get the message out in the same way that they used to. And so, and they've also been stopped by platforms like Twitter from amplifying. So advertising, for instance. And that means that they haven't got as great a reach. So proxies, you know, the kind of, you know, gray actors that where influence might be hidden, are becoming more important to Russia's campaign. And likewise, actually, even for democracies, the kind of the gray of communicating via actors when you're putting out truthful information, but you're obscuring the source, is becoming a more common tactic. Because if you're trying to communicate with an audience that maybe doesn't trust you because they've been watching a lot of RT and have been, you know, believing Russian narratives, then obviously you're trying to put over a message through credible sources, and you can't necessarily always label it, you know, this is the voice of the United States government. So the kind of different threads that are coming through are really important. And we're seeing also, you know, Russia exploiting truthful information too. So, you know, if you have some kind of like genuine reporting on like Azov battalion or something that's happened in the New York Times or something like that, they obviously are going to exploit that, you know, real truthful information. But the way that propaganda is done most effectively is to seat this kind of white truthful with fakes and with, you know, distorted information, stuff that's coming through what looks like a journalist or what looks like a reliable outlet, but actually is really being fed by you know, a state actor. And that kind of sort of coordination of propaganda is key and is really important. And I think that's where we get lost when we focus on just disinformation. We also are hearing misinformation quite a lot. And I think it's really important to stress that misinformation actually isn't a part of propaganda, which is, as I said, deliberate. Misinformation is about people just accidentally getting things wrong. And actually, that's a really important part of our free speech in a democracy, is for people to actually be able to get things wrong. I would say that, like, for me, I've started to feel concerned about the approach, for instance, of like the Department of Homeland Security to organize their response to falsehood online according to what they're calling MDM. So misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, which is the, releasing, like doxing or releasing personal information without someone's consent to hurt them. Now, only one of these is actually part of influence operations, these deliberate aggressive campaigns that we're talking about here. And seating things that are unintended activities within the same threat framework with intentional state actors' propaganda campaigns, I think leads us down a path to essentially solutions that try to police the internet in an unhelpful way and fail to understand the really important motivations and strategies of deliberate actors that are doing harmful things on the web.
Wow. Okay, that was helpful, and you also said a lot. I'd like to just make sure that I'm tracking. So I'm envisioning some kind of like a Venn diagram, and if we could just look at maybe propaganda and disinformation. So there's some overlap there, but not all disinformation is necessarily propaganda, right? Because it seems like I don't know. Let's just use Russia, but Russia can, or Russian-backed operations, troll farms can be just barfing up all kinds of disinformation into our social discourse that's really not connected with any kind of a state propaganda campaign, right? I mean, does that make sense to you?
Well, if Russia's barfing it up, then it would be a state propaganda campaign, I would argue.
Well, but I guess the thinking that I'm having is that it's not part of a state campaign, other than they're just wanting to throw sand in the gears of our national discourse, but it's not necessarily propaganda. Or I mean, maybe that's just flatly wrong. So it is therefore disinformation. Does Russian propaganda completely encompass any form of disinformation?
I think
as
what you're talking about there is actually more subversion, which is turning groups against each other and using information for disruption. I consider that part of an information campaign as well. It's not the same as trying to convince everyone to like Russia, yeah?
Right.
It's not trying to persuade us that Russian, alleged war crimes are not really happening, yeah? But it's trying to, like I said, affect our behavior, our ideas, our feelings, perhaps, yeah? That, the ultimate goal might not necessarily be to get us to form an opinion about Russia. It might be just to disrupt our society, but they're using an information operation to do it. Yeah?
Sure. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. So propaganda has a negative connotation, and you've touched on this a little bit, but is propaganda inherently negative? Can you think of examples of propaganda which you would consider to be, I don't know, but benign, I guess?
That's why I said I tend to think of it in a neutral way, and I know not everyone will agree with this, but I think it's actually helpful for us to historicize it, to be able to say, actually, this is an activity that has always happened. It might be we are using different tools today, but it has been going on since year dot. and actually has a complex array of ethics, yeah, that we need to consider both for ourselves as democracies and what are the limits of what we think is acceptable, which is constantly under debate and should be. And in order to acknowledge that there's a debate that needs to be had, we kind of need to be honest about what the hell we're doing here and what should be done with respect to like domestic citizens, foreign actors, in what circumstances, whether they're aggressive or not aggressive, and so on. And I think the issue of like it being always wrong, of course, I think we are all persuading all the time to try to get people around to our point of view, to try to influence our environment around us, to try and get jobs. To persuade is to be human, yes? We want to change our future world. We want to make sure that perhaps, if you believe in trying to save the planet and stop climate change, that might be something that you would consider to be a positive, use of persuasion. But the rules of how we do it and why, and ensuring that like we are not deceiving people against their interests is a really important, debate that we have to have. There are, some instances, I think, when even deception can be arguably ethical. If you are saving large amounts of lives and you are then maybe explaining afterwards why this deception happened, and you are only targeting foreign aggressive state actors, perhaps, yeah. So in the context of war, we have certain rules that are appropriate and that are inappropriate, and it's important to be able to debate that kind of thing and what's acceptable at home and abroad. And I think you can't really do that without including debate about the whole spectrum of what's ethical and not ethical about propaganda.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it really, for me, just illuminates partially, I guess, why this is such a hard problem, in that all of this resides on a spectrum. All of the definitions are fuzzy and blurry, and there are there are legitimate reasons to lie sometimes. I mean, you could argue all this stuff. There are legitimate times when lying might be the right thing to do, and it resides on this ethical continuum. Everybody, arguably in life, we are all constantly trying to influence our environment. I mean, all the time. And we are literally influencing our environment all the time just by breathing. We're affecting the environment. So anybody that tries to plead some kind of like safe zone, or they're always operating in the white, is probably deluding themselves. So maybe we can move on to one of your articles. So like I said, these will be in the show notes, and she has another article which will be in the show notes as well. But this one is from the February 2021 timeframe, so about a year ago. It's called "The Grim Consequences of a Misleading Study on Disinformation." So you mentioned that this research is needed on the industry behind influence operations. But like I said, this was about a year ago. Could you unpack this article just a little bit, and also talk about has anything changed in the year or so since it got published?
Great, yes. So this is an article I wrote because a study came out by Oxford Internet Institute, Oxford University academics, which was attempting to, respond to a lack of data about the industry behind influence operations. So there are a lot of companies, like I was involved in 2018 exposing Cambridge Analytica, the campaign that worked for the Trump campaign and worked on Brexit and on a number of other quite unethical campaigns around the world. It also worked for our governments, for the United States government, the British government, for NATO, doing training and things like this in information warfare. Now, this company and its defense contractor parent, you know, these kinds of firms, like there's a massive industry out there. I'm currently talking to the Information Professionals Association. I'm sure many of you are out there doing communications campaigns with private companies. But what we don't really have is any kind of sense of like how many Cambridge Analyticas are there out there, companies that are doing unethical activities. And we've had this whole debate around disinformation and disinformation for sale, you know, companies that might be putting out like really very misleading and unethical campaigns, abusing data and so on. And, you know, we need to have more data to sort of assess, well, to what extent is like really unethical stuff happening? We don't want to smear an entire industry. And we do want to say, well, how do we encourage an ethical industry, you know? And you can't really do that without knowing fully what's going on in the, both in the information operations space, like, so what are those kinds of companies doing? What are, you know, what companies that work in political consulting and or even commercially, in advertising and so on. We need to understand the business behind it in order to understand the incentives that are in place, that, you know, whether there's any regulation that's needed or would be helpful to respond to these companies, not just the platforms, because we've seen a lot of regulation of the platforms being discussed. We're not really talking about, well, what needs to be done to prevent Cambridge Analytica type situations. One thing I argued for instance, in the wake of Cambridge Analytica's wrongdoing, was actually more rules on, you know, whether governments should be able to demand transparency by these companies if they are working for Russia at the same time as working for us, for instance. So you see these conflicts of interest might be there. And if we don't have data, if we don't know much about the companies, if the industry is quite opaque, it's very difficult to know, you know, what's going on in order to sort of understand the problem properly and put it in context, you know, in order to not just be exaggerating. The study that I was reading and critiquing there really based its sample on what was being reported in the media.
Right. It's almost like the study was accepting like self-reported numbers as some kind of you know, truth, or you know, some kind of a signal, and yeah, then like, you know, saying, okay, good, well, this is what it is. And I think you're saying, hang on a second, right?
Yes, I am, because you know, there had been in 2016 onwards, there was a massive increase in reporting of disinformation for sale. So all these campaigns, you know, that the media, it became a big media story. And so obviously there was a lot of reporting around it, but often it focused on particular firms. And so if you just look at what's reported in the media about these firms, you're only going to see the few that were commonly reported. And you're going to see a heck of a lot of reporting about this subject suddenly. Now, to claim that disinformation for sale suddenly appeared in 2016 because we had a lot of media reporting of it is obviously, you know, a flawed argument. And so what I'm trying to do myself actually is to look at the industry, you know, itself and say, well, you know, what companies are out there, not just looking at what's been reported in the media, but trying to, you know, do interviews and my own kind of background research on the industry myself, because it's obviously I've been researching that industry for a long time. And I've put together a database of about 1,400 companies so far. working in this area. They could only find 56, which seems kind of crazy. So I think what we need is better data, and we need to also include companies that aren't doing anything wrong, because if you only look at the ones that are, you end up with skewed reporting on the industry. And actually, there may well be quite ethical companies out there that are doing good things. And we want to get a sense of, well, to what extent is the wrongdoing? Yeah, how much of that is there within a wider industry that may well be quite legitimate? Yes.
I see. And I think this starts getting us toward one of your other big points, and how these dynamics, kind of like as like a frog in the pot of water, and the pot of water is heating up slowly, and the frog doesn't notice. I think this starts getting towards some of your comments about public trust eroding, or public trust being at risk, and your other article, which is entitled Government Efforts to Counter Propaganda Risk Undermining Public Trust. Could you start unpacking that a little bit, please?
Yes, this particular research of mine was actually looking at what the Canadian government were doing with their propaganda efforts, if you want to call them that. They were trying to respond to, what we've seen in recent years, this really, concerning uptick in Russian propaganda. And they were trying to, update their systems, as every government is, and come into the digital age in how to respond to these kinds of threats. Now, they hired the parent company of Cambridge Analytica, a spin-off, the same people who work for that company had set up a new company, and they hired these guys to train their personnel in public affairs, which was a bad idea in my view.
What could go wrong?
Yes, exactly. They also
Okay.
they also ended up creating a kind of a hybrid of using information activities, which is kind of like the psychological operations element, which is normally for foreign audiences, and kind of intelligence methods for targeting domestic citizens in care homes during the coronavirus pandemic, which was an enormous scandal and very concerning, and was shown to have broken their own rules. And I think this is because, they are trying to experiment. There are people trying to supposedly innovate. I don't want to use that word because it makes it sound good, but the problem is that when you've got people trying to respond quickly, but you're not going through the right authorities to make sure that you develop good policy and so on, and communicate it properly as well, you end up with these kinds of failures. And the Canadian defense minister has actually responded and has done, they launched an investigation into this, and are reviewing their policies, which is great. But what I wanted to say is actually, it's so important to secure public trust in a time like this, when we have these really disturbing disinformation campaigns. We are trying to respond to them by, introducing measures such as content moderation with platforms, with, putting out information about public information about health and so on. If you are doing things like this and messing up on your public communications, and not being truthful, not being clear about what you're doing, processing people's data in ways that are only going to arouse suspicion and distrust, this is a disaster in the making. And it is exactly the sort of thing that Russian actors will exploit, or anybody, looking to, undermine those kinds of really important national security measures and responses to disinformation campaigns. So this kind of paranoia operations that we're seeing, people who are trying to make every little thing that is done to try to mitigate harms on the internet look like it's censorship, or look like it's an attack on free speech, disingenuously sometimes, at the same time that they are building a career out of like a growing media profile out of these arguments. People are exploiting these kinds of claims, and the best response by government is actually to be transparent about what you're doing, to try to not overstretch and overreach and be launching data gathering expeditions unless you need to, and to be thinking very carefully about doing really as little as possible, and making sure that what's being done is well communicated.
Yeah, well, I mean, this definitely begs the question, or I'd love to get your opinion on the recent announcement about Elon Musk buying Twitter and taking it private. It seems like this has really galvanized, there's broadly two different sides of this public discourse, right? There's one side where folks are heralding this as like, yes, free speech is going to win the day, and it's going to be a glorious thing because of that. But the other side is like, oh my gosh, this is the darkest thing that's ever happened. We're all doomed. I suspect that your answer would be something a little bit more subtle than those two extremes.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I am uncomfortable about Elon Musk and his the fact that he has said that he's concerned about Russia, and its ability to put out its message and so on, at a time when we've got a really bloody and horrific war of aggression taking place against Ukraine. I'm very worried about the way that he's going to oversee and govern this platform into the future, but it's very hard to know exactly what this means. One of the things, I don't think we had a perfect platform in the first place. So I don't think that I see this as like going from, okay, what was a great situation to what is now a disaster. Yes, I'm concerned, but I think I was concerned already anyway, and I don't think that it was being governed well. So for example, the other article, which I'm sharing with you, which is called How Russia Benefits from Ill-Informed Social Media Policies, and it's been published by Brookings. This actually kind of looks at these kind of censorship debates, where, some quite, really quite high-profile actors of, journalists are arguing that, that Russia is being censored, and their arguments are being censored at the same time as, like, so Glenn Greenwald, for instance, is going on Fox News to say this. I don't have that big a profile, So I think these kinds of arguments about censorship are actually quite loud, and I think that part of that has been fed by these social media platforms, who've put in place strategies that have been a little bit misguided. They, for instance, take down a post that might be breaking their guidelines and their rules. This policy that they have of content moderation, which responds when there's something that's false or harassment or something like that on the platform, they will take the post down. Then some actors actually use that to gain an even bigger profile. So they're not really being censored, yeah, but they are using this to actually then amplify the original message. They take a screenshot, which includes the original false tweet or, harassing tweet that was put out the first time. And then a whole load of their community circulate that, and it gets to a much larger audience. So it's not really been censored, but the same post is being shared, but with a much larger and more concerning argument of censorship, which of course isn't happening because it's actually being put out there. But that seems to happen multiple times with these accounts then getting resurrected by the platform. So very often, it'll be people concerned about the tweet, report the tweet or the account to, Twitter. And you get quite often a lot of different people reporting tweets that maybe they disagree with or that they are concerned about because it contains false information. Then Twitter takes them down. They quite often put them back up again the same day or the next day. So they're not down for very long. So if it's censorship, it's like very momentary. And actually then accompanied by this big campaign arguing like, we're being censored, which goes viral. Yeah. And so it amplifies it, if anything, like, and I see, a lot of people arguing that, in this way, Russia's voice has been censored. Well, actually, Glenn Greenwald is arguing, for instance, that Russia has been overly censored and in this kind of reporting of accounts, to Twitter, complaining about their, false posts or harassment or whatever it might be, it's all gone against Russia, and it's not been targeting Ukraine. Well, I've been finding actually that there's a lot of reporting of Ukrainian accounts as well. It seems to go both ways. It's not in one direction, as is often claimed. And yet we don't really hear about Ukrainian accounts that are struggling to actually get their message out at a time that their country's been invaded. And they have been taken down by Twitter. They are being also suppressed in various different ways by these social media companies because of these content moderation practices. And the trouble is that these platforms don't really communicate well with audiences about what's going on. When an account gets suspended by the platform, it just says account suspended, and you get like a very generic message as to their policies. It doesn't really explain to you why that was taken down and the harms it was having. And so I think this helps to, unfortunately, reinforce this belief that the takedowns of accounts are arbitrary and one-sided or unfair, when actually I think that often the social media companies are trying to do this in an even way. That doesn't mean they're doing it well.
Yeah. So you said a lot there. One thing, so we talked about this before we started recording, but just for our audience, when you're talking about accounts getting taken down, you're not talking about like cyber attacks and the accounts just like blip disappear, but rather Russia is petitioning Twitter saying, hey, these accounts here are doing things that we think is wrong. Also, probably these accounts are doing things that we don't like, and we're just going to say that they're wrong. But Ukraine's doing the same thing. I mean, this is this is a war, and Twitter, I guess, is a not unwitting. That's not right. A battleground. Is part of the battleground, but when Twitter was founded, whenever it was, 2004, 2008 or something, they weren't founded one day saying, one day we're going to be a part of the information war.
Also be weaponized. So they don't mean to be weaponized in the sense of like their social media content moderation. So the practice where when an account is reported, they make a decision about whether or not that's valid, and they take it down, or they may other penalize that account in different ways. But actually that's what you've got to do is to think about the actors behind campaigns. So this point I made earlier about how there's been very little research and understanding behind who's running influence operations is relevant here, because what we're doing is, well, what social media platforms are doing is treating everyone like they're the same. Now that means if you're somebody who's an ordinary like actor online putting out things that you think are true, but they're actually false and it's misinformation, this word we mentioned earlier, or if you are, a proxy of the Russian state and you are trying to get out their message, you're being treated essentially according to the same kind of rules.
To your point about all accounts being the same, I mean, some accounts are completely bot driven, or mostly bot driven, and that's completely different from somebody who is just a typical human wet brain Twitter user. But also all of this is becoming increasingly bot driven, or computational decision making, both on the side of reporting accounts that appear problematic, that might be problematic, and that could have an agenda behind it. But then also on the Twitter side, or the Facebook side, or pick a platform side, the decision-making algorithms are not transparent. They're not perfect. There's ways to argue on all sides that, hey, our side's being unfairly treated, or hey, our side is being unfairly treated. You're both right, probably. Let's just say, going back to Elon Musk, one of his overt statements. I mean, let's just stipulate that what he's saying here is legitimately what he wants to do. And one of the things that he said is that he wants to make the Twitter decision-making algorithms more transparent. Good thing or bad thing? What do you think?
I think this seems good. I've seen some concerns raised that by making the algorithms open source, that then will reveal any glitches that could then potentially be exploited by bad actors. So I think that might be something that needs to be considered by Twitter. But generally, I think it would be great to have the code open source, as long as they can do it in a way that is going to be safe.
Oh wow! So you're making the case that potentially making these algorithms open source would be akin to putting out step-by-step instructions on how to build a machine gun, or well, I mean, if they're open source, people can take them and build upon them in ways that could be awesome, or could be devastating.
Well, could be abused. Okay, so
yeah.
If there are the point is that if there are glitches, if you like, or things that aren't, I mean, algorithms are obviously complex and are often too complex for humans to understand when they're on this kind of scale. And so, it's possible that there are, vulnerabilities that would be in the algorithm or the code that, if you're then an actor trying to find vulnerabilities in order to exploit them for hacking or for all sorts of God knows what, then that may be possible. But I'm not saying that that's definitely the case, but it's a risk that needs to be considered. I do think actually that this also doesn't fully address the problem I just mentioned about content moderation. Content moderation, it's not only about the algorithm and how the algorithm distributes, your feed, or what you see on Twitter. It's actually also about automatic processes whereby they are trying to detect and process reporting of accounts. So when somebody like me or you, it doesn't have to be a state actor that reports a falsehood online. Obviously, the platforms have their way of assessing whether this is a genuine post, a problem with the post or not. Now, some of that initially might be, kind of organized and sorted automatically according to algorithms, but there's also human elements involved. So people do come in at some point in this process with a lot of this to evaluate whether or not, especially on big decisions like taking down a major account, whether or not they should be taken down. Sometimes humans are getting it wrong. But actually, a lot of the deficit isn't just about like an inadequate or unfair decision. It's actually about a decision that doesn't understand the implications of particular accounts. So different accounts are being run by ordinary people, by state actors, by journalism organizations, by activists, by groups that are masquerading as legitimate actors but aren't, and so on. And without knowing anything about those different accounts, all you can do is to act in exactly the same way, really, in response to the content. And what I'm arguing is actually we need to know more about those actors in order to respond in a nuanced way, because actually taking down misinformation, so people getting it wrong and they're ordinary citizens, the post might be the same, but if I'm less concerned about, your grandfather putting out a post that's false than I am about, the IRA in Russia producing these things, and masquerading as a citizen of the United States. So the actors behind these campaigns really matter, and we need to understand those better. And actually, the platforms can't understand these. So this is why this is a much more complex problem. We actually need researchers like me, or other transparency practices in place. We need maybe some kind of regulation for the influence industry firms that might be playing a role in some of this, to think about, well, what do we need to be making more transparent? What rules do we need of like what's ethical and so on, and how do we respond to this, more than just about policing the platform and taking down, okay? Because it's a more complex problem than this can ever solve.
Yeah, no doubt, and we've just begun. I mean, the information age is still in its infancy, and today's problems will probably seem trivial to tomorrow's challenges. So yeah, continuing to understand and mitigate this is no doubt important. So you've given us a lot to think about, Emma. Before we close, are there any other resources that you might be able to share with our audience that would help them dive into this a little bit further, or anything else that you think would just be of interest to the Cognitive Crucible audience?
Well, I, as a woman who researches disinformation and propaganda, I actually run a community on Twitter of academics. We basically boost anybody who researches this area who's a woman, because we're kind of often underrepresented and so on. So if you want to follow Women in Disinfo, it would be great. We have fantastic professionals in this industry who are doing amazing research on this subject. I also have 2 books that are coming out. One, the Routledge Handbook on the Influence Industry, which is co-edited with Vian Bakir. I also have a book, Propaganda Machine, coming out in due course. My last book was Propaganda and Counterterrorism, Strategies for Global Change, which you can get in all the bookshops. But also, I mean, I run a YouTube show, and I frequently have really incredible researchers come on my YouTube show. So if people have found this interesting and they're interested in these subjects, they might well want to look that up. It's called Afternoon Tea and Truth Biscuits, and it's very laid back, and it's just me having afternoon tea with with all of my guests who research propaganda and do incredible work on this subject. So if you want to learn more, these are where I would recommend you have a look. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, with that, thank you, Dr. Emma Briant, for dropping some truth biscuits on us today. It's a complicated problem. There are no simple answers, it sounds like. And so with that, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
I appreciate you inviting me.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.